Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this second lecture in our Ancient Attire digital lecture series, where we look at dress clothing and vestimentary codes in the ancient world. And today we're here to listen to the presentation by Dr. Laura Quick on divine dress divinization and dethronement in the Hebrew Bible. Dr. Quick, Laura, is Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Oxford, and she is also Tutorial Fellow in Theology and Religion at Worcester College at University of Oxford. Laura does incredibly interesting research, and she always has, I must say. She's published widely on dress, adornment, and the body in biblical literature. Her most recent book is this one, came out in 2020. It's called Dress, Adornment, and the Body in the Hebrew Bible, published by Oxford University Press. And if you haven't read it already, I can strongly recommend it. At the moment, Laura is working on a research project on beauty and aesthetics in the Hebrew Bible and the wider ancient Near East. And it is, in a way, a teaser or an extract from this research project that she's going to share with us today. Eventually, this will be a monograph on beauty in biblical literature. Laura will do her presentation in roughly 30 minutes, and then we have ample time for question and answers afterwards. And Laura, thank you so much for being with us. I just have to remove a pin from myself and stick a pin in you instead. There you go. And then please go ahead, Laura, the floor is yours. And thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Please do shout if there are any technical problems. And thank you so much for this invitation as well. I'm really delighted to speak to you all today. Okay, so my paper today is called Divine Dress, Divinization and Dethronement in the Hebrew Bible. And it's focused on what have been called the marriage metaphor texts. So the marriage metaphor texts are some of the more ethically difficult for modern readers of the Hebrew Bible. They develop the metaphor of the city Jerusalem or the kingdoms of Israel and Judah personified as a woman who is married to God. But this woman is unfaithful to her divine husband, with the metaphor focalizing Israelite and Judean idolatry. So in the same way that this woman has gone after other gods, so too have the Israelites gone after other deities. So the text therefore describe the woman's adultery and subsequent punishment, and they often make explicit references to sexual acts, to nudity, and to violence against women. Today, my focus is going to be in the main on the marriage metaphor in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, where it's the city Jerusalem who's personified as the wife of God. But I'll also be making references to other examples of the metaphor from the wider Hebrew Bible. And my focus is specifically upon the language of clothing, which is found throughout the chapter in Ezekiel. When we meet personified Jerusalem, she is nude, and in the course of the chapter, she is dressed by God before being stripped after her adulterous activities. And today I'm going to argue that by looking at the specifics of the language and imagery of dress in this chapter, new insights about the marriage metaphor and about the relationship between God and personified Jerusalem can be brought to the fore. So personified Jerusalem is dressed in a specific embroidered garment, along with other items of dress and adornment, including fine linen and gold and silver. And exploring the implications of these clothing items in biblical and extra-biblical sources, I'm going to argue that these items connect the woman to the divine sphere. So they transform her status. Dressing the woman in these items can therefore be understood as an act of divinization, making her into and marking her out as appropriate for marriage to a deity. And this means that the converse of this, stripping the woman, can therefore be understood as an act of divine dethronement, so removing her divine status. So in Ezekiel 16, divinization is followed by dethronement, and in each case, this is activated through procedures of dress and undress. So if we begin, when God first encounters personified Jerusalem, she's just been born, so she's nude. And then when she reaches her sexual maturation, God becomes desirous to marry her, and his response to her involves various items of clothing. So then I passed by you and watched you, noticing that you'd reached the age for sexual love. I spread my cloak over you and covered your nakedness. I swore a solemn oath to you and entered into a marriage covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. Then I bathed you in water, washed the blood off you, and anointed you with fragrant oil. I dressed you in embroidered clothing and put fine leather sandals on your feet. I wrapped you with fine linen and covered you with veils. I adorned you with jewelry. I put bracelets on your hands and a necklace around your neck. I put a ring in your nose, earrings on your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. You were adorned with gold and silver, while your clothing was of fine linen, veils, and embroidery. You ate the finest flour, honey, and olive oil. You became extremely beautiful and attained the position of royalty. So as several scholars have already noticed, in the wider Hebrew Bible, these items of dress are connected to the furnishings of the Jerusalem temple, as well as to the dress of the high priest. So the term for leather also describes the temple covering. Shesh, fine linen, describes the composition of the temple, as well as its curtains, hangings, and the high priestly vestments. Gold and silver are used frequently in both temple decorations, as well as its vessels and utensils, and in the dress of the high priest. And the term rikmah, embroidered fabric, is clearly important since it's listed twice. And this is also used for the temple furnishing to describe the temple's decorated fabric screens, as well as the decoration upon the high priest's sash. So for Carleen Mandolfo, all this suggests that the marriage metaphor in Ezekiel 16 is drawing upon Jerusalem, the temple, rather than Jerusalem, the city, or Jerusalem, the community. So the idea is that, according to Mandolfo, it's the Jerusalem temple which is being personified in the text, in contrast to other marriage metaphor texts, where it's the city who's being portrayed as the unfaithful bride. But rather than equivalizing the woman with the temple, I'm suggesting that the clothing items should be understood in the larger context of cultic or priestly dress in biblical and ancient Jewish literature. And in fact, the fabric items which dress the temple are identical with the various colors, textiles, stones, metals, and motifs that make up the dress of the high priest, as described in the book of Exodus. And I think this is something we'll hear about in more detail in the upcoming talk by Soren Lorenzen in this lecture series. And I've also discussed it more fully in my book on dress and adornment. So the embroidered dress of the high priest and the embroidered dress of the temple are in fact one and the same. And this is probably unsurprising, given that cultic or priestly dress in the ancient Near East likely derived from the practice of dressing the cult statues of deities, which would have been housed inside temples. So the dress of the priesthood emulates the divine garments. And this suggests that we explore the use of embroidered fabric, as well as cultic or priestly dress more generally, across biblical and ancient Jewish literature, where this is frequently connected to the heavenly sphere, and hence was appropriate to dress both priest, temple, and even the deity. So the biblical Hebrew term rikmah is a feminine noun, which occurs frequently in the Hebrew Bible with the meaning embroidered fabric, as well as to describe other variegated materials, such as the multi-hued feathers of a bird. The related verb describes the process of making the brightly coloured fabric. And so the participle form therefore refers to somebody who produces this fabric, either from embroidering or from weaving. The semantic range of this field of terminology in biblical Hebrew therefore refers to the production of a variegated material, most usually fabric that's multicolored. And this fabric seems to have implications of the cult, since it occurs most frequently in the clothing of the high priest and the furnishing of the temple, as described in Exodus. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the same term is also used to describe variegated materials, again, particularly for clothing and fabric items. And there's a really interesting occurrence of the term in the Damascus document. So this is a legal code from the Dead Sea, which describes the proper functioning of an ancient Jewish community. And in one fragment of this document, we learn that people who grumble or complain against the fathers are to be expelled from the community and never return. But those who grumble against the mothers are only going to be punished for 10 days. And the reason for this discrepancy is because the mothers do not possess any embroidered fabric. So this is quite intriguing. Cecilia Wasson has considered this law in her study of women in the Damascus document. And she interprets the titles fathers and mothers as honorifics rather than in the biological sense. So she raises the possibility that there's female leadership in the community. But this punishment for grumbling against the male and female leaders differs. And this is apparently based on the possession of some sort of embroidered fabric item. Wasson then looks at other instances of this fabric in the Dead Sea Scrolls, finding that it occurs frequently in heavenly or divine contexts. And consequently, she suggests that the term refers to a special item of embroidered or multicolored clothing, which the mothers lack. And that this is specifically used in worship led by the fathers and designed to signify a connection between the community with the heavenly realm. So she therefore argues that this text is evidence of the functioning of male religious practitioners in mystical and spiritual worship. And so her argument here is based primarily on the use of the term in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we find it occurring in a variety of associations with the heavenly or divine sphere. So it's used to describe the clothing worn by angels, the clothing of the future Messiah, and even to describe the appearance of the glory of God. But we might also make the argument from the direction of the Hebrew Bible, where the dress of the high priest in embroidered fabric similarly suggests the divine connotations of the cloth. And in fact, as I've suggested, priestly dress in the Hebrew Bible is itself related to the textiles which dress the temple, and that this can be connected to the practice of dressing cultic statues of deities in the ancient Near East. So in light of this practice, we might relate both the priestly dress and the temple furnishings to the clothing of the cult statue, which was housed inside the temple and tended to by the priest. So priestly dress, temple furnishing, and the dress of the divine cult statue are therefore one and the same. And as such, embroidered fabric becomes perfectly appropriate for both the temple furnishings and the dress of the high priest, as we see in the biblical literature, but also for the dress of other divine or heavenly beings, such as angels, the Messiah, and even God himself, as we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this argument might seem a little bit surprising, given that the biblical tradition is well known for its anachronism. But in fact, several biblical texts attest to the dressing of cult statues. And this is a practice which is well known from elsewhere in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. So the central event of the Panathenaic festival in ancient Athens, for example, is the presentation of a new peplos, a fabric garment worn by women in ancient Greece, to dress the cult statue of the goddess Athena Pelias. And in fact, in the books of Kings, we find women engaged in weaving activities inside the Jerusalem temple itself, where they're spinning textiles for the goddess Asherah. which can be interpreted as clothing items to clothe the cult statue of Asherah that was housed inside the temple. So the presence or absence of a cult statue of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple remains contested, but it is possible and even probable that at one time God himself was represented in the temple in a physical form. And in light of the dressing of cult statues in the Hebrew Bible and the wider ancient Near East, we should probably assume that this statue would have been clad in clothing. And in fact, the clothing of God is recalled at several places within the Hebrew Bible. For example, in the book of Isaiah, where the hem of God's cloak fills the temple and he appears dressed in crimson clothing and royal attire, or in the book of Daniel, where God is dressed in snowy white. That the dress of the cult statues of deities may have led to the development of the priestly vestments is also suggested via the semantics of the term ephod. So this is a culturally specific term, so it's quite difficult to translate, and it's usually just transliterated in English. In Exodus, it occurs as an item of priestly dress and is explicitly said to be made from multicolored fabric, so gold, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and finely twisted linen worked in a rich design. But as well as an item of priestly dress, it can also be used to refer to a cult image, as is the case in the image which is crafted by Gideon in Judges 8. So some scholars interpret this item to be a sort of cultic object which has the appearance of a garment, but it's noteworthy that this object is made from golden jewelry, including earrings, suggesting it to be physically quite weighty. And this also recalls the golden earrings used to fashion another cultic object, the golden calf in Exodus 32, as well as the human images, which will be crafted from gold and silver jewelry in the text, which is our focus today, Ezekiel 16. So in light of the connections between the ephod of Judges 8 to the golden calf of Exodus 32, it's likely that Gideon's ephod describes an image suitable for worship. And in fact, there are several other texts in the Hebrew Bible where the term ephod seems to describe not an item of dress, but some object suitable for worshipping. So the term ephod can therefore describe cultic images, perhaps even ones which have been dressed in garments. And this seems to be the case with Gideon's ephod because it's made from purple cloth as well as these golden earrings. And in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 10, we also find cult statues dressed in purple clothing. So it seems like purple is particularly appropriate to dress divine images. And the term ephod can also describe the clothing worn by the high priest. And so if we accept the suggestion that priestly dress developed from the practice of dressing divine cult statues, it might explain the origin of this surprising extension of the term ephod to include both an item of priestly dress as well as a cultic object for worshipping. As well as clothing, in the ancient Near East, cult statues could also be adorned with jewelry. And this also seems to be the case in the Hebrew Bible. In 2 Samuel 12, David takes a crown from an individual called Malcham, literally their king. But in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, this is taken to be a proper name, Milcom. And this relates to the cult statue of the Ammonite deity who was called Milcom, and therefore to the practice of dressing cult statues in clothing and jewelry, in this case, a crown. So David's removed the crown from the cult statue of Milcom. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, this specific item of dress that's worn by Milcom in 2 Samuel has connections to priestly dress. So in Zechariah, this is the type of crown which is specifically part of the dress that's worn by the high priest Joshua. And the term also occurs in parallel to the generic term for the priestly headdress in the book of Ezekiel. So this type of crown has connections to both divine and priestly dress. And notably, it's the same item of adornment which is worn by personified Jerusalem in the text, which is our focus today, Ezekiel 16. Alongside being adorned with a headdress, more generally priestly dress was highly ornate and elaborate. The priestly robes were woven with gold thread and hung with golden bells, and the high priest wore a golden diadem upon his headdress. And this is unsurprising, because in Exodus 28, we're told that these clothing items were made specifically for glory and for beauty. So the term kavod is usually translated in English as glory, but it's also used in the book of Ezekiel to refer to the radiance of God, where God's appearance is equivalized variously to amber, fire, to bright light, and even to a rainbow. Sean Zelig Astor has compared this divine imagery to Mesopotamian conceptions of divinity, where the radiance of the deity is described by the Akkadian term Melamu. So cult statues were therefore plated with bright metals, such as gold and silver. They'd be dressed in costly robes with gold and silver embroidery and adorned with gold and silver jewelry in order to presence the deity's shining radiance. And the high priest is similarly dressed in golden fabrics, golden bells, and other golden adornments. And we're told that these clothing items are made with kavod, divine radiance, in mind. So the priestly dress therefore related the wearer to a specific image of the deity as glorious, radiant, and shining, and which was itself dependent upon Mesopotamian depictions of divinity. So far we've seen that cult images of the deity were clothed in the biblical and ancient Near Eastern imagination. And there's one additional text which is important here. And in fact, this text specifically promotes embroidered fabric as an item associated with divinity, and in a context which is very comparable to Ezekiel 16. So this is a sacred marriage text recently identified and published by Tawny Holm. Sacred marriage refers to a genre of ancient Near Eastern literature which describes the union of a god with a goddess, or sometimes a goddess with a human king. And in this latter case, there's some debate as to whether human proxies are involved in the formalization of the union. And Holm has identified a sacred marriage in column 17 of Papyrus Amherst 63, which is an Aramaic text written in Demotic script. So the climax of the union occurs when the goddess Herem Bethel is lowered onto the marital bed, which is dressed in embroidered fabric. And the Aramaic term utilized here is cognate to biblical Hebrew rikmah. And this is significant for several reasons. Papyrus Amherst 63 likely dates from the 4th century BCE, representing the traditions of a diverse Aramean community that had come from Egypt. But as Holm shows, some of the individuals involved in producing the papyrus must have come from Judah and Samaria, because there are multiple literary parallels in this text to biblical literature, especially to the Book of Psalms. And these Arameans were clearly familiar with the idea of a sexual union and marriage between a god and a goddess. And in the context of the formalization of this union, embroidered fabric is employed as the specific textile of the marital bed. So this confirms the use of this prestigious material in divine conjugal contexts. So the use of embroidered fabric in the sacred marriage of Papyrus Amherst 63 is therefore reminiscent of the use of embroidered fabric in the dress of personified Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16. So in light of the discussion so far, it seems reasonable to view several of the items which adorn personified Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16 in relation to the divine sphere. So I've argued that the dress of the high priest, as well as the textiles within the temple, developed from the practice of dressing divine cult statues. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, therefore, embroidered fabric becomes a textile which is appropriate for dressing angels, the Messiah, and even God. And similarly, the fabric is related to the goddess in the sacred marriage text from Papyrus Amherst 63. And Jerusalem is given the same embroidered fabric. She's also given gold and silver adornments, including a necklace, nose ring, earrings, and a crown. And as we've seen, precious metals have connections to and reflect divine radiance. The cult images of Exodus 32 and Judges 8 are also crafted from golden earrings. And Jerusalem's crown is the exact item worn by the cult statue of Milcom in 2 Samuel 12, as well as in priestly dress. So the clothing items therefore have significant connections to the dress of divinity. The sequence of washing, anointing, feeding, and dressing, which the woman is subjected to, also has similar implications. So as we've seen, a fairly typical explanation for Jerusalem's clothing items is to connect them to the temple furnishings as well as to priestly dress. But as I've argued, priestly dress may have itself stemmed from the practice of dressing cult statues of deities which were housed inside temples. And we might also connect the washing, anointing, dressing, and feeding of the woman to the treatment of cult statues in Mesopotamian ritual. Multiple Sumerian and Akkadian ritual texts document the procedures by which the material form of a cult statue was animated. And these procedures are known by scholars as the mouth-washing rituals. The basic procedure involves the washing of the statue's mouth, hence the name, but it develops to include washing and purification more broadly. So the statue can be purified with water, anointed with oil, and then its mouth opened with substances such as honey or syrup. The statues could then be dressed in their precious attire and adorned with crowns. And following their animation, the statues were then rendered appropriate to receive offerings, typically bread, flour, or beer. So the various elements of this ritual have clear commonalities to the treatment of personified Jerusalem. So this mouth-washing ritual functioned as a ritual of transformation. And through the ritual procedures, the statue was detached from its human origins and entered the divine realm. And in the same way, we might interpret the dressing and other elements in the description of God's treatment of personified Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16 as acts of transformation aimed at affecting her transition into the divine realm. We might note that because of God's various attentions to her, the woman becomes extremely beautiful. But as well as yafeh, beauty, she's also bestowed with hada. The former lexeme, yafeh, typically denotes the beauty of humans in biblical literature, while the latter refers to divine beauty, the beauty of God's holiness. And as such, it's often translated into English by terms such as glory or splendor, rather than beauty or attractiveness. And in the wider Hebrew Bible, divine beauty is not typically identified with creatures, and nor is the term for human beauty, yafeh, ever said to be an attribute of God. So these concepts are usually kept distinct, creating a division between the divine and human realms. But personified Jerusalem is both beautiful and glorious. So she transcends the human realm and takes on this aspect of divine appearance. Jerusalem's various gowns and crowns therefore connect her to the divine sphere. And as such, she becomes suitable to marry a deity. In this context, we might note personified Jerusalem's behavior with the various items which God had gifted her. You took some of your clothing and made for yourself decorated high places. You engaged in prostitution on them. You went to him to become his. You also took your beautiful jewelry, made of my gold and my silver I had given to you, and made for yourself male images and engaged in prostitution with them. You took your embroidered clothing and used it to cover them. You offered my olive oil and my incense to them. As for my food that I gave you, the fine flour, olive oil, and honey which I fed you, you placed it before them as a soothing aroma. So much of the focus on this passage has been upon the sexual aspects of the woman's behavior. But we might also note that she uses her clothing items to make for herself decorated high places, places of localized regional worship. She uses her jewelry to fashion human images, reminiscent of the cultic objects fashioned by Aaron and Gideon in Exodus and Judges, and which was similarly cast from jewelry. And she clothes these images with embroidered fabric, and she offers to the statues olive oil, fine flour, and honey. So again, these behaviors are reminiscent of the treatment of cultic statues in ancient Near Eastern religion. Ilona Zolnay has also interpreted personified Jerusalem's behavior here in light of the treatment of statues in ancient Near Eastern religion, arguing that this is an example of the woman's idolatry. So according to this argument, the woman is worshipping these images akin to Mesopotamian tradition, and this highlights that her idolatrous crimes constitute foreign worship practices. But it's also important to recognize that prior to gifting the items to these images, these items were initially provided for the woman herself. So she was being treated as if she were a cult statue. When they were lavished upon Jerusalem as the divine bride of God, these items were licit, but now they're appropriated outside of the Yahweh cult, they become illicit. So it's not the function of the items in divine adornment in itself that's problematic, but rather their use in worship practices towards gods outside of the cult of Yahweh. So consequently, Jerusalem is stripped of her finery, and it's often noted that this punishment is the same treatment as that befitting an adulterous woman. But we could also understand it as another act of transformation. So just as the crowns and gowns and the other elements of dress in Ezekiel 16 connected Jerusalem to the divine realm and so made her an appropriate bride for God, by removing these items, her divinity is now denied. So today I've argued that personified Jerusalem's embroidered garments and gold and silver adornments connect her to the divine sphere. As we've seen, these items occur in a variety of different contexts in biblical and ancient Jewish literature, as the dress appropriate for cultic functionaries, as well as the temple, and even to dress angels and deities. And in fact, as I've argued, these two usages are connected, with priestly dress developing from the practice of clothing the divine cult statues which would have been housed inside temples. Other elements in the investiture of personified Jerusalem also recall procedures appropriate for a divine cult statue. As such, Ezekiel 16 dresses Jerusalem as a deity to make her an appropriate bride for God. But personified Jerusalem then uses these same items to worship other cult statues. And since this behavior falls outside of the cult of Yahweh, she is subsequently stripped of her clothing and so also of her divinity. So divinization is followed by dethronement, in each case activated through procedures of dress and undress. And my focus today has been on Ezekiel 16, but these conclusions may be significant for understanding other instances of the marriage metaphor in the wider Hebrew Bible. In the book of Hosea, we also find this metaphor, and in verse 10, we see God gifting various items to personified Israel, including grain, wine, olive oil, silver, and gold. But the woman then uses these items to worship the god Baal. And in verse 14, this seems to refer to the worship of Baal idols, since Baal occurs in the plural. So consequently, these items are stripped from the woman along with her clothing. So this therefore constitutes a comparable instance in which items explicitly used in idol worship were initially gifted to God's bride. And so in light of the treatment of divine cult statues in the ancient Near East, and this analysis of Ezekiel 16, we might understand these verses in Hosea as a comparable instance of divinization followed by dethronement, again activated through dress and undress. And this is my final point, so I'm nearly finished. In Jerusalem, in the book of Ezekiel, Julie Galambush provides an exploration of the function and background of the marriage metaphor in the Hebrew Bible. So she treats the origin of the metaphor of the city as a woman in the wider ancient Near East, where the capital city could be personified as a goddess who was married to the patron deity. But in Ezekiel, she concludes, the city as wife of God is demoted from divine to mortal status, arguing that the metaphor had become dead in the biblical period. So according to this argument, in the biblical period, God's bride no longer has any divine status. And this contrasts with earlier work on the marriage metaphor in biblical literature, which tended to connect the imagery to polytheistic manifestations of Israelite and Judahite religion, and the idea that God had at one time had a divine wife. The interpretation of personified Jerusalem's clothing and its divine implications, which I've developed today, could be instructive for this question. As I've argued, the gowns, crowns, and other embodied aspects of the women's presentation and treatment can be understood as acts of divinization in order to transform her into an appropriate bride for God. So understanding the function of clothing in this chapter therefore has consequences for understanding the origin of the marriage metaphor in Ezekiel 16 and the wider Hebrew Bible, with the implication that God's bride was at one time understood to possess divine status. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and I hope you all join me in thanking Laura with a Zoom applause here, which is the best we can do. Thank you so much. That was wonderful, really a lucid and stimulating lecture. And now we have time for questions and comments. And I think there's actually, I can see everyone here in the Zoom panel today. So please go ahead, either raise your digital hand or send me a message in the chat if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. And actually, I've written something down, so maybe I could get us started, Laura, because, well, I think I have one sort of comment and then something that's probably more of a question. But the comment is about how you presented Jerusalem as the city woman goddess, how she somehow seems to cover both the concept of city and goddess, but also temple in a way, as you showed with your comparison with the high priest, and how just as he is treated with washing and anointing, and in a way you could even, I know the blood is washed off Jerusalem, but if you look at the mention of the three ingredients there in the text, blood, water, and anointing oil, yeah. Exactly, that's exactly the three liquids that the priests are also treated with when they're initiated, but in a way also the temple, because of course the temple is cleansed with blood and anointed with oil. So I wonder, would you say that Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16 is also a little bit temple-like or more goddess-like with the relationship to the high priest?
It blends all three, I think. That's really interesting. It's really helpful to think about priestly initiation as a kind of comparable context. I mean, something that I didn't go into in this paper are kind of marriage rituals. So I think there's a Sumerian text that talks about Inanna preparing for marriage, and some of the procedures that she undergoes are comparable also to the women in Ezekiel 16. But I also wonder if they're not comparable to the treatment of the priest, who's kind of anointed with lovely perfume and dressed in all these lovely clothing, almost like the priest is like a bride of God. So there's all this kind of blending of different elements in this woman. She's priest, temple, goddess.
Yeah, no, that would make sense, definitely. And it's like, the fit is not accurate, but it's a really alluring, almost overlap in a way.
Yeah, I know you've written some really wonderful papers on perfume in the priestly dress, and he's kind of like he smells like a hunk, like he's wearing all these lovely perfumes. And we also see them in kind of context to do with alluring women, like in Song of Songs. So yeah, I think the idea that maybe the priest is being dressed as a bride perhaps also could relate to this point.
I really like that. Thank you. Let's see. Now I have to keep up with the chat here. So Sorry, I'm a little bit behind. I can see. Sarah Cook, you had a comment. Please go ahead, Sarah.
Oh,
Oh.
hi. Sorry, I typed it in the chat. I'll just go ahead and read it out for you, Laura.
Thanks.
Firstly, thank you so much for your presentation. That was awesome. So I was asking if you could comment on the power dynamics of Yahweh clothing, washing, and feeding his wife / Jerusalem / the temple. When you describe worshipers doing this for a cult statue, I view it as a kind of gesture of supplication. So I'm wondering, is Yahweh a kind of supplicant when he washes clothes and feeds his wife Jerusalem / the temple? Thank you.
The dynamics, the power dynamics in this chapter are really interesting, but also quite complex because it mixes different metaphors. So this woman is God's bride, but she's also in some way his child. And so there's kind of an unpleasant power dynamics within this chapter. I don't know, I sort of don't want to emphasize God as being too subservient for her, given that she starts out as his newborn child, which he sort of adopts. Some of the language of clothing in this chapter has also been interpreted by Malol and a couple of other scholars as in the context of adoption practices. So like God spreading his cloak over the woman seems to have connections to a kind of legal texts about adoption. So he's sort of her father as well as her husband. And so I'm a little bit wary about pushing that too far as an act of supplication, because I think he's the one who holds the power in that dynamic. But I have to think about it a little bit more. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Rob, you had a comment about Gideon.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Laura. I love your book on dress and adornment. It's a big help in my research. But quick question on Judges 8 concerning the ephod that Gideon makes. Are we as the readers supposed to understand that Israel misunderstood the purpose, that, in other words, that it became a snare? Does that indicate to us that there was a double meaning? Gideon had one meaning or purpose for the ephod, but Israel misunderstood and switched the meanings, similar to what you're seeing with what you presented about the bride taking the garments and then redirecting them, repurposing them.
Possibly. I think that, I mean, I guess it's controversial, but I'm of the view that there probably was a cult statue in the temple at one time. I mean, certainly there were statues of Asherah. We know that because they're removed from the temple in the books of Kings, and that this statue would have been dressed in clothing. So at one time that was licit behavior, but it becomes illicit, right? Like the things develop. So yeah, a kind of misunderstanding is a helpful way of viewing it. Like, I don't know, is it licit behavior or is it illicit behavior? It probably depends on the time period and so it's definitely open for misinterpretation.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Then I have Davida Charney.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Your talk is fascinating. And I'm just wondering whether there's a connection to, because you were mentioning the priestly garments, I was wondering if there's a connection to the tzitzit from both in terms of the use of fringes and in the use of color. I know that argaman and techelet are always associated with temple and royalty, and because of, I suppose in the case of techelet, because of its rarity. I don't know about argaman, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, my colleague Eleanor Lyle, who is at the University of Exeter, she has a forthcoming monograph on the significance of color in the Hebrew Bible, which I feel like I should really emphasize because I think she's done a really lovely job of looking at all of the different implications of purple and blue, both of which would have been made from a snail that only occurs on the Tyrian coast. So they're very prestigious, they're very rare, and they have all these interesting implications. And in the wider ancient Near East, as well as in the Eastern Mediterranean, they're particularly associated with royalty. But she argues that in the Hebrew Bible, the text almost tried to disconnect these colors from royal dress, and they apply them purely to priestly dress and in divine context. So it's kind of like a separation of like royal and divine context with these colors. So they have all these interesting connotations. So I think it's really significant that the priest is dressed in purple, in blue, in all these prestigious colors, and it clearly has connections to the divine sphere. I think I mentioned in the paper that in Jeremiah and the ephod created by Gideon, there also seems to be connections to purple colored fabrics. So purple is clearly significant as an item used in divine clothing. So yeah, definitely, I think colors are really important, and the multicolored fabric, the embroidered fabric, again, it would have been really difficult to produce, to dye. It's yeah, very prestigious. So yeah, that's a really helpful point. Thank you.
So just to take it a little bit further is, so in the commandment for the people to put fringes on their garments, at least, and a thread of the techelet as part of the texts surrounding the Shema, is that conferring some special status onto each person? If this is one of the occasions in which it's not a priest, it's definitely not priests or divine, aristocratic people.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. If you look at the legal texts or the legal texts addressed to non-priestly people that relate to clothing, there aren't actually that many. Cross-dressing is banned. You have to wear these tassels. And then a really key one is you can't wear mixed fabric. And what's kind of interesting is if you look at priestly dress, that's explicitly made from a mixture of yarn and linen. So it's definitely made from mixed fabric. So it seems like on the one hand, I think, yeah, the blue color in these tassels is kind of making them like sort of giving them a special status, but they're still not allowed to wear priestly dress. They still have elements in their clothing that has to be kept distinct. So they're not quite at the same status as the priest. He's a bit higher.
Just to come back once more is to say that, it would also have been very obvious, if it is that hard to get the techelet, so that if you're commanding Jews to wear something that has techelet on the corners and fringes that are going to be visible, it's it's also an identity marker, both for unity and for distinction from others.
Yeah, it's going to be very expensive as well, which I guess is why it occurs in only the court, like it's not a full garment. It's also very smelly. This is something that I read a really interesting article. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the scholar, but she's an archaeologist who tries to reconstruct this dye based on recipes from antiquity, and she said it absolutely stinks. And yeah, even after you wash the garments, things that have been dyed with this particular dye are going to have a very distinctive smell. And then I think we maybe can connect this to the fact that the priest is drenched in perfume because he's really going to stink. But yeah, I think identity, the colors, on the one hand, that's like a visual marker of identity, but it also has other kind of things that could distinguish you, like smell. So yeah, bringing in the kind of sensory aspects of it, I think, strengthen this argument that it's going to separate people out and make them seem distinct from others.
Thank you.
Certainly adds a new meaning to the stinking rich. But I could just jump in to say that Elena Lyle from the University of Exeter, whose book is coming out in a while, I think, on color, she has an article coming out relatively soon in the journal called AVAR, AVAR, which is open access, exactly on purple.
Oh,
So
brilliant.
there is a chance to take a sneak peek into her work with that article, and that should be out before the end of the year. And I think the book may be a little longer. So
Yeah, just to add, the book is not just about purple. She looks at lots of
no,
different
all the
colours.
colors, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been allowed to look at the manuscript for the book as well, and it's incredible.
Yeah,
So
it's really good.
yeah. No, thank you so much. Ekaterina Kozlova, you had a comment about Ezekiel 16.
Oh, yes, that was just in the reference to what Laura mentioned about the image of Jerusalem at the beginning of the chapter as a child, a newborn, and so on. And so I just wanted to point out that in addition to Mir Malul, there are other people who discuss Jerusalem there as a child, as a daughter of God, but then how that metaphor can be traced throughout the chapter, not just at the beginning. But Laura and I had some session, and Laura kindly provided a draft of her talk to me previously, because I also was working on Ezekiel 16, and I mentioned to her that this idea of Jerusalem being treated as a cultic, that is in Ezekiel itself, in the book of Ezekiel itself, and in some of the other portions of the Hebrew Bible, idols or foreign gods are compared to, well, they're represented through this disgusting fecal imagery. And in Ezekiel, the word Gelulim appears about 41 times, meaning that all of these idols are compared to dung, filth, and dirt. And so at the beginning, when Jerusalem is first born, she is almost treated as dung, which is described by her community. She's thrown out, she's in the field, she is like human waste there. Towards the end of the chapter, she's portrayed as consorting with idols, Gelulim again, and so that language of disgust is present throughout, that fecal language is present throughout, either of Laura about how purple is connected to unpleasant smell as well. And so this rhetoric of disgust is communicated through different ways. It's smell, it's something that you see and which is unpleasant. Do you have any other ideas of unpleasant elements there?
That's really helpful. I think that's a good answer to Sarah's question as well. I guess like tending to the statue, or to the woman as if she was a statue, might at first seem like it's kind of respectful or an act of supplication, but actually if you look at the wider context of Ezekiel, as Katya says, statues are not really such positive objects. They're objects of disgust. So it kind of fits in with this maybe more degrading imagery of a woman who's stripped, who's treated like garbage. There's a lot of violence in this chapter, and I think Katya's reading is really helpful for bringing that across, and actually works really well with the interpretation. There's possibly elements that relate the woman to a statue as well. So thank you so much, Katya. That's really helpful.
Thank you.
But it's also interesting. Sorry.
Go ahead.
But it's also interesting how the text appeals to our senses, to our different senses, right? So it's our smell that is engaged, it's our sight. I mean, if we exercise our imagination in reading this text, all of our senses are engaged. And
taste as well, the honey, beer, flour.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thanks. I think you see this, I mean, definitely in Ezekiel, but also if you go to some of the temple texts in Exodus as well, it's such a multi-sensorial textual universe that we are being invited into. It's really fascinating. We have time for one final question or comment before we have to end for today. Or maybe you feel sufficiently enlightened already. I actually do have one question, Laura, I think it's quite a simple one in a way, because it's about the translation of Rigma. And I've noticed that there is a tendency towards being open to a broad translation as either embroidered or woven multicolored fabric, but there is also, I sense a tendency to lean towards embroidered. And is that because we know something, or is it just habit?
It's a little bit of a debate. I do
Okay.
have a perspective on it. So some people think it's like woven fabric. Some people think it's embroidered fabric. Let me get out my notes on this. 1 second, I'm sorry. Okay, so when it occurs in Exodus with the participle form, so to describe the rokam, the person who's actually making the fabric, it seems like the fabric is already extant, and then his job is to make it into something colorful. So that to me suggests embroidery rather than like weaving it from scratch. But there's a few different views on this, and yeah, I've been contacted by somebody else who completely disagrees and thinks that it refers to a weaver, and it's often translated in the participle form as a weaver rather than an embroiderer.
Well, no, that Exodus argument seems really persuasive. Thank you. I was just, thanks. Very interesting.
So my translation is quite programmatic, embroidered fabric. But if you think that if it's woven fabric, I guess multicolored fabric would be.
Yeah. No, but I'm ready to go with embroidered. Definitely. I was just curious. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking Laura for her presentation today, and this really, really interesting discussion, I just wanted to mention, as Laura already did, that we have another Ancient Attire lecture coming up in October. It's Friday, 21st of October at 3 p.m. And it's Dr. Søren Lorentzen from the University of Bonn. And he is going to talk about the High Priest and his glorious camouflage. So an analysis of Exodus 28. So please do join us for that. And then Laura, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your research with us. It's been an absolute delight. So thank you.
Thank you everybody for listening and for your questions and comments.
Okay, and with this, I just want to wish you all a very, very good weekend and thank you for now. Bye-bye.